Hey, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is the final part in a two-part series where we look at testing asynchronous code in Angular with Jest. Last week we were looking at testing timers, and this week we are finally looking at testing promises. This one's super highly requested, so I won't leave you waiting any longer. Let's jump straight into the code and start writing tests. So to start off with here, we are using the same project that we used in my last video where we were looking at testing timers with Jest. If you haven't watched that video, I'll leave a link for that in the description, and I'll also leave a link to this project in GitHub as well. Now, as always, I've added a component with an assortment of methods for us to test. So if I just get that up here, get these side by side, we'll start our tests running, and then we'll hide all this to give ourselves a little bit of real estate room here. So before we actually get into writing any tests here, I want to add a little disclaimer. In my day-to-day job of writing Angular, I very rarely write promises. I find that most of the functionality that you get out of a promise, I tend to fall back on observables, and the only real time that I tend to use promises is when I'm working with a third-party package or an SDK or something. So I actually don't have many use cases for promises in writing tests. So instead of using some real world examples here like I usually would, what I've tried to do is I've tried to just think about promises in their various forms and where I might run into them. And I've written some methods that cover those so that we can write tests against them. So if you find that I've missed something or I haven't been very clear, or you've just got a real world example that isn't covered in these tests, make sure to leave me a comment below. I'm usually pretty good at getting back to people within a couple of days. And if I can't come up with a solution, at least I can probably point you in the right direction of finding one. So with that, let's start looking at our first method. We've got a really simple method here. We pass in a string. When it resolves, it returns my full name. And when it rejects, it returns a thumbs down. So first of all, we need to do what we always do. We need to add a describe block in here. And it's good practice to use the name of the method for your first describe block. We give it its callback here. And then we look at what tests we need to write. So looking at this, we need two tests. We need one for when it resolves and we need one for when it rejects. So it should return Ryan Smee if Ryan is passed. Let's give it our callback here. And we'll give it a semicolon on the end there. So what we'll find with promises more than anywhere else when we're testing with Jest is there's a few different ways we can do things. There's not necessarily a right or a wrong way, but I'm going to show you the different options that we've got, and I'll tell you which option I think is best and why. So with option one, if you're familiar with how you would test a promise in Jasmine, you'll be very, very familiar with this. What we do is we just call this like we'd call a normal promise. So we go fixture, we call our method, we pass it Ryan, and then all we do is we test our callback. So then we want to give this a result for us to test. And then in here we add our expect result to equal, and then Ryan Smee. And we add our semicolon on here. There's one other thing that we need to add, and this is a done callback. We add this in here, and then we add it down here. And what this does is it tells Jest, hey, I've got something asynchronous here. I need you to hold off from finishing this test until this done callback is fired. Now, if I save this, we're going to get a success, and that's great. As I say, this is a perfectly valid option, and we could just move on to writing other unit tests here. But for me, something that is as important as having tests pass is what happens when they fail. Because realistically, the only reason we're writing tests is to catch when our code fails. So if I change this to be Tom, and then I save again, let's see what error we get. So if we scroll up here, we've got that the callback was not invoked. It tells us what test wasn't invoked, but it doesn't really tell us what went wrong. And then if we scroll up a little bit further, we've got this console error here that's telling us the value that was received. And this is fine, but if we've got 1,000 tests here, it's going to be very, very hard to pin down what went wrong and why. This next one's pretty similar, so I'm going to copy that and then comment it out. We're going to go down here, we're going to give ourselves an option 2 heading, and then I'm going to paste this here. Now there's a few slight differences that we make. Instead of using the done callback on this one, let's remove that and remove that from here. And let's add a return to here. This is working in a similar way with Jest to the done callback. It's saying, hey, I don't want you to finish running this test until this returns. So if we save this and we see what error it gives us. If we scroll up, we got ourselves a slightly better error here. It's telling us what test went wrong and it's telling us the value that was received. We don't have to scroll up and look through the console logs and try and work out which test that applies to. But still, it doesn't tell us what value we were expecting and why it's failed. It's just telling us it's failed with a thumbs down. So let's look at our third and final option here. Comment this one out. We give ourselves an option 3 header here. Now we start off with a return like before, but instead of listening to our promise with a then callback, what we're going to do is we're going to jump straight to an expect. So we go expect, then we name our method in here. We're going to add the wrong name here again so that we can see the errors. And then this is where Jest helps us out with its matches. It gives us resolves, and then we say to equal, and then we say Ryan Smee. Now, because we've used this resolves, it knows that it's dealing with a promise, so we don't have to do any of the messing around with the done callbacks or any of that stuff. So if we save this and we wait for this to compile, now when we look at the error it gives us, it tells us that it received a promise reject instead of a resolve. That's great. It's telling us what went wrong there. It's telling us what the value we received was. And this matches in a lot more with how the rest of our tests look. So if I change this to give us a positive, we save that. And there we go. We've got our test passed. That's great. So now let's look at our second test. And with this one, we'll say it should reject with, and we're going to give it a thumbs down emoji. And that'll be fine for us. We'll give it its callback. Now with this one, we have the exact same issues as above. We can use similar options. We can chain off of our promises catch method and test things that way. But once again, Jest has our back. We can do exactly what we did above. So we can go expect fixture.name our method. We're going to give it a wrong name here. And then similar to below, we are going to chain off it with a jest matcher. And this time we're going to use rejects. Rejects to equal. And then once again, we'll use our emoji here. And put a semicolon on the end. We'll run this. This will pass. And with this, if I put in Ryan here, we will see the errors that we get. We scroll up, and once again, we've got a really clear error here telling us what we were expecting and what we actually got. So let's change that back to Tom so that it fails or succeeds, whichever way around you want to think about it. And there you go. And that's all we really need to know for testing this first type of promise. So now we've got a very similar method to the one above, but instead of just returning a new promise, we're using the async await syntax here. So let's add ourselves a describe block like always. Do this. We will give it our method's name. We will give it a callback here and a semicolon on the end. Now I'm going to copy these two tests because we actually want the same outcomes. And I'm going to paste these in here, and then we're just going to delete everything that's inside them. I just wanted kind of the titles of them. So with this first one, we also have a couple of options. Now the first thing we want to do, because we're using the async await syntax, we actually have to tell our test that we're doing that. So we use the async keyword here, and then we look at our first option. Now with this first option, what we want to do is we want to map the return of our method to a variable, and then we want to test that variable. So if we go const, we go result again, equals await, and then we add our method here. And I pass it Ryan. And then down here, we go expect result to equal, and then Ryan Smee. We save that, we'll get a success again. Once again, this is perfectly valid, and I've seen tests written like this loads. I do have a slight issue with it again, that if I save it and it's got the wrong value here, the error it gives is pretty similar to what we had with the other option ones. That it's just kind of telling us what the value was and not really what we were expecting. But my biggest problem with this is we're writing this in a completely different way to the way that we're writing the ones above, which for me is just loads more things to remember. So we're going to comment this out. We're going to go here. This time we're going to start off with an await, and similar to above, we're going to jump straight into our expect. So we say expect, then we call our method here. We're going to pass it the wrong name again and put in the spaces. And then we do exactly what we did above with the matches. We go resolves to equal, and then we say Ryan Smee. Save that. We're going to get a failed test, but we'll get a better error this time. Scroll up and we get the exact same error that we're getting for this style above as well. So let's change this to something that's going to actually pass. And once again, with the one below, we're going to copy and paste. It should be exactly the same, with the only difference that if we add this to async and this to be rejects. We add the wrong name in here. So great, that's awesome. Now we know how to write tests for methods that return promises in their various forms. But a lot of the time we're not actually dealing with that. And so our next method is slightly more complex. In this method, we're not returning anything. We're calling one of the methods above. We want to make sure that when it resolves, it sets the welcome message. And then when it errors, we call this method. So let's scroll down here. We'll give ourselves another describe block here. Once again, we use the name of our method and we give it a callback. Now, before we go any further, I've just realized that I made a mistake. This actually errors. We haven't added our emoji here. I was on autopilot a little bit there. We add our emoji here, we click save, and this will now pass. So for this first test, it should set welcome message with the returned full name. And we give it its callback here. So if you've watched my other videos on tests and observables, you'll know that we need to mock the response of this method. So what we need to do is we need to spy on it. So we go jest.spyOn. We tell it the method we're spying on is in this fixture, and then we give it this method's name. And then what we'd do with observables is we'd go mock return value and we'd pass in the observable here. Now we can do the same thing with promises here. I would just have to go new promise, blah, blah, blah. Instead of doing that, actually Jest helps us out here. We can go mock resolved value, and then all we need to do is pass the value that we want it to return. So for this, I'm going to say Travis Barker. This is just to illustrate the point that it doesn't matter what's going on in this method. We don't care. We're mocking what returns from it. So if we go here, we put a semicolon on the end of this. The next thing that I like to do is I like to make sure the value we're testing is reset before the method is run. So if we go fixture and we go welcome message and we'll go equals undefined, it probably already equals undefined, but one of our other tests might have set it. So it's just good practice to put this here. Now, next up, we call the method we're testing fixture.setWelcomeMessage, and we can pass any value into here at all. And then finally, what we might expect to happen is we go here, we go fixture.welcomeMessage, and then we'll go to equal, and then we'll say Travis Barker. We might expect that if we save this, we get a pass test, but actually we don't. And what it says is it says that the value is actually still undefined. Now, what we might try next is we might try to add our done callback in here. We add a done on the end here. We save this again and hope that it calls it. But yet again, we get a failed test and it's still telling us it's undefined. And the reason for this is all to do with the JavaScript event loop. Now, if you don't know anything about the JavaScript event loop, or you're just hearing about it now, I am not the person you want to listen to learn about it. If you just do a quick search on YouTube, there are hundreds of really, really great videos that explain it inside and out. And as a JavaScript developer, it's something you probably want to know because it's always useful to have in your back pocket when you're wondering, hey, how comes my promise fired before my set timeout? Right, let's pause real quick there. After telling you that I wasn't the person to describe the event loop to you, I then spent the next 10 minutes eloquently describing the event loop, but then when I came to edit it, I realized that that eloquent description was actually me babbling for 10 minutes. So what I've done is I've cut that out and we're going to jump straight to the point where I just tell you how to fix this issue. So keeping that in mind, here's how we fix this. What we do is we say process and we say next tick. Now, this is a node method, but it works perfectly fine here. What we want to do is we want to take these and we want to slot them inside here. And basically what this is saying is, hey, the payload of this test here, I want you to fire it next tick, which in turn means that our promise has resolved or rejected by then. So if I save this, we will get a success. Of course, no, we won't, because we haven't written welcome here. If we go along and put an exclamation mark on the end and then we save that, this time we'll get a success. That's great, and that's passed. As I say, it's a bit gross. Honestly, it pains me a little bit. If anybody knows a better way of doing this, please put it in the comments. But I've looked around on Stack Overflow, I've read lots of documentation, and I can't find a more robust way of doing this. So for our final one here, we want to add an it block. It should call the name of our method when, let's take this, rejects. We'll add our callback here. And as you'd probably expect, this works almost identically to the test above. We add a done callback here. So the first thing we want to do, we want to once again spy on our promise. It's in this fixture. We use our promise name that I'm going to copy and paste from here. And this time we want to mock the rejected value, and we're not actually using the value that's returned. So I'm just going to write null in here. Doesn't really matter. Now there's one other thing that we need to spy on. This time we're checking to see if this method gets fired. So up here above this, if we go const, I'm going to take the method name, put spy on the end, and then jest.spy on. It's in the fixture again. And we put that there. Now we want to call our method. It doesn't matter what value we pass here. So I'm going to put Tom again. And then finally, we have to do this process next tick stuff again. Inside here, we want our expect and then our spy to be called. And then don't forget our done callback just to say that, hey, we're finished. Save that and this will pass as well. And that's awesome. So with that, what we've learned will probably cover most use cases when it comes to testing promises in Angular. But I thought I'd try something new. So what I've actually done, if you go to the repo for this project and you check this component out here, what I've actually done is I've added some other methods in here. And what this does is it combines everything that we've learned in this video and also all of the stuff we learned in the timers video that I did last week into a few different methods for us to test here. I've set up the spec file here. And then what I've also done is I've created another branch that is with bonus tests that will have all the answers there for you. If you run into any issues when you're trying to go through these, drop me a little comment below. I'm really happy to help. Or hit me up on Twitter at @TheRyanSmee. Honestly, I'd be really chuffed to see how people get on with these. So on that note, that's everything that I wanted to cover in this video. Hopefully it's been helpful and worth the wait. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.